Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones said, "When I heard Heartbreak Hotel, I knew what I wanted to do in life. It was as plain as day. All I wanted to do in the world was to be able to play and sound like the way Scotty Moore did." Everyone wanted to be Elvis. I wanted to be Scotty. "You've got to hear this," said the 14-year-old English girl, dropping the needle on a spinning 78. This was the spring of 1956, and all her friends at school were going crazy over Elvis Presley's. It was like nothing they ever heard before. The girl's younger brother sat staring at the record player, transfixed, as she explained that the slapping, metallic sound he was hearing was an electric guitar. "We didn't know the guitar player's name when we heard that song," recalls a young Jeff Beck. "They didn't list the musicians in those days. But my sister kept drawing my ear to the different things, the solos and all that. If it wasn't for that experience, there's no way I would ever have thought about any of it." Elvis stuff was the real start of it. That was a rocket ship taking off for a whole bunch of us. And I'm sure it was. There were many more up-and-coming guitar players just like Keith Richards and Jeff Beck, watching and hearing that ship take off. Scotty was one of the first to bring rock and roll up to the front on records and television. Scotty had a lot of help from Elvis Presley getting his guitar playing out there, and many say if it wasn't for Elvis, we might not have ever heard of a Scotty Moore. And maybe that's true, but there's a chance without Scotty Moore, we might not have heard of Elvis Presley either. So let's take a look back and see why I say this, and then you can make your own assumptions. He was born Winfield Scott Moore III on December 27, 1931, in Humboldt, Tennessee. Growing up in the small town of Gadsden, just down the road from Humboldt, in a musical family where his daddy and brothers all played guitar, he naturally started playing the instrument himself. At 16, he quit school and joined the Navy to see the world. This opened his eyes to many different styles of music besides the hillbilly and country fingerpicking he was raised up on. Scotty was open up to the blues, R&B, and especially jazz, and incorporated them into his own style. After being discharged, Scotty came back with a whole new and different style of playing. He had formed a few bands while in the Navy. Now, back home in Tennessee, he decided to move about 100 miles southwest to Memphis and took on a job working for his brother's dry cleaners. This was in 1952. After arriving in Memphis, Scotty formed a band called the Starlight Wranglers with a stand-up bassist, Bill Black, and a singer, Doug Poindexter. Around this time, Scotty had met Sam Phillips, who owned Sun Records and Recording Studio. They got along real well, and Scotty actually became a studio musician of sorts at Sun Studios. Scotty, Bill, and Doug Poindexter had put out a record and were playing around the Memphis area. But now old Doug was about to become a footnote in rock and roll history, as one day Sam Phillips called Scotty and asked him and Bill Black to give this kid singer a listen and see if he might be worth recording. His name was Elvis Presley. So a jam session was set up at Scotty's home on the 4th of July, 1954. Scotty Moore, along with Bill Black, who just lived a few houses away, were to meet and jam with Elvis for the very first time. That same day, Scotty called Sam back and said, "Well, the guy sings good. He doesn't really knock me out, but he can sing and he knows many different songs." So the very next evening, Scotty, Bill, and Elvis walked into Sun Studios, and after a few hit-and-miss songs, they started a jam on the song That's All Right Mama. Sam got it on tape, and as they say, the rest is history. Elvis was to sign a management deal with Scotty, and they played their first gig a few weeks later at the Bon Air Club in Memphis on July 17, 1954. At this time, Scotty had owned a few guitars throughout his life, but there's probably two that is worth mentioning here. Well, maybe three. But the two that probably meant the most to the history of rock and roll were a Gibson ES-295 that he played on some of the first Elvis recordings and live shows, and then around 1955, almost 1 year to the day after he played on Elvis's first recording of That's All Right Mama, he traded that ES-295 for a Gibson L5. But stepping back a few years, before he bought that first Gibson, I thought this was kind of interesting. After getting out of the service, he bought himself a Fender Telecaster and a Fender amp in 1952. Although the guitar didn't last long, as Scotty traded to the Houck Music Store in Memphis for the ES-295, saying, "The streamlined Fender just didn't feel right when I played it. It probably had something to do with its shape. The Gibson was more feminine. I could make out with the Gibson. I couldn't get it on with a Fender." On July 7th of 1955, Scotty would trade that ES-295 in on the Gibson L5. As you can see here by the receipt, the L5 cost him $629.28 with the case. And I'm guessing here, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the FC next to the added charge of $56.56 that brought the total to $685.84 was possibly the balance that he still owed Houck Music on the ES-295. He was given $225 trade-in, which brought the total owed to $460.84. Now that was some serious money for a guitar back in 1955. A few years later, Scotty would change guitars again, trading the L5 in on a Gibson Super 400. But these two guitars, the L5 and especially that ES-295, were the ones guys like Keith Richards and Jeff Beck and George Harrison first heard on them early rock and roll recordings. That ES-295 bounced around Memphis for years. Eventually, Memphis singer and good friend of Elvis, Jimmy Velvet, bought it for his memorabilia museum. Today, it's part of a collection belonging to Larry Moss, who in 2007 put it back in Scotty's hands so he could play it a little. Larry is a devoted Elvis fan and recognizes the importance of the 295, calling it the holy grail of rock and roll guitars. Scotty worked with Elvis full-time until he went into the Army in '58, and again when he came out in 1960. But by then, Elvis was spending all his time doing movies and didn't do many shows. So Scotty worked recording sessions, movie soundtracks, and even a few appearances in a few of the movies. Scotty would work with Elvis up through the Singer's '68 comeback special. At that time, Elvis was growing tired of the movies and was planning on getting out of them and was in the stages of planning out the Vegas shows. He wanted Scotty to go with him, but it was going to be 6 weeks of practice and shows, and Scotty said, "You know what it means to be out of town that long? It's like starting over." So Scotty turned it down. I think the money and Colonel Tom Parker had a lot to do with that. By then, Elvis had no say in the business end of things, and he always remained loyal to the Colonel. And although a gentleman, Scotty has never really had many nice words to say about the Colonel. Then Scotty finally decided to hang it up, literally. Not only did he never work with Elvis again, or even see him, Scotty virtually stopped playing the guitar for the next 20-some years. It was time for him to move on. He did some work as a recording engineer and starting his own business, Music City Recorders, but for the most part kept out of the spotlight, became kind of a recluse to the press, granting very few interviews. So there isn't really much information on him during that time. But Scotty started turning up as the 1990s rolled around, and it was good to see him out there again. He was back to recording, doing interviews, and just jamming with so many players who you could really tell looked up to him. Keith Richards, who was easily Scotty's biggest fan and became friends with him later on, had this to say. He was a gentle, unassuming guy. He liked his scotch. They didn't call him Scotty for nothing. So in 1996, I went up to Woodstock to do a session at Levon Helms' barn with Levon, Scotty, and Elvis's old drummer DJ Fontana. It was a session of good old boys. There was plenty of whiskey that day. So Keith decided he was going to attempt to shake down Scotty on one of his guitar parts in particular. Keith said, "There's a rundown that Scotty does on several cuts, which I've never quite figured out." So when I asked Scotty, he just gave me a sly grin and said, "There'll never be another Scotty Moore." When Scotty was asked who was his inspirations growing up, he really didn't have a direct answer and simply stated, "All I can tell you is, I stole from every guitar player I ever heard over the years, put it in my data bank, and when I played, that's just what come out." He was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2000, then the Musicians Hall of Fame and Museum in 2007, and the Memphis Hall of Fame in 2015, with his friend Keith Richards accepting the award on his behalf. By this time, Scotty's health was failing. Scotty Moore passed away on June 28, 2016 in Nashville, Tennessee at the age of 84. He was buried with his parents in Humboldt, Tennessee after a brief and private ceremony. His guitar playing came to light when Elvis broke big, but I believe Scotty played a big part of that. He took his style of playing and molded it around Elvis's singing style to create that early first sound. And that's what caught so many young guitar players' ears, and in turn, they passed it on down. So if you started out learning guitar riffs from guys like Page, Clapton, or Jeff Beck, maybe the Beatles or the Rolling Stones, your playing today has a lot of Scotty Moore DNA in it. We all carry on what Scotty started back in 1954. Hope you enjoyed this video on Scotty Moore. If you did, I'll add a few more right here you might enjoy also. Appreciate all of your support and hope you'll leave me a like and maybe subscribe on your way out too. But just stick around and watch a few more videos. I gotta run. Thanks for watching.